The most profound connections we form often begin not with what we say, but with what we awaken in others. When someone misses you, truly misses you, they're experiencing something far deeper than mere absence. They're encountering a reflection of their own unconscious needs, desires, and unresolved aspects of themselves that you've somehow managed to touch. Consider for a moment, have you ever wondered why certain people occupy your thoughts long after they've left the room? Why their absence creates not just emptiness, but a distinctive psychological pull? Carl Jung would suggest this isn't coincidence or simple chemistry. It's the language of the unconscious, speaking through our emotions. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, Jung wrote. This insight reveals a profound truth about human connection. What draws us toward others, what makes them miss us, often lies in what they see of themselves in our presence. When someone misses you, they're not just missing your physical presence. They're missing how they feel about themselves when they're with you. They're missing the parts of their own psyche that you've helped them access, perhaps without either of you fully realizing it. In American culture, we often reduce attraction and longing to simplistic terms: chemistry, compatibility, or physical appearance. Television shows and films portray connection as something instantaneous and obvious. But the psychology behind meaningful attraction runs much deeper, touching on what Jung called our shadow and our anima animus, the unconscious aspects of ourselves that we often project onto others. Think about someone who has deeply missed you in the past. What did you represent to them? What parts of themselves did they discover through knowing you? And conversely, who have you missed with that same intensity? The answers reveal not just your attractions, but your own psychological landscape. The words we'll explore in this video work because they speak directly to these unconscious processes. They create space for projection, recognition, and the kind of psychological engagement that triggers not just surface-level interest, but a deeper form of emotional and psychological longing. Let's consider the first key phrase, "I see you completely." This seemingly simple statement carries immense psychological weight. When we tell someone, "I see you completely," we're acknowledging not just their conscious self-presentation, but also the parts they keep hidden, their fears, their vulnerabilities, their unrealized potential. In Jungian terms, we're acknowledging both their persona, the face they show the world, and their shadow, the aspects they hide or repress. This recognition is profoundly affecting because most people move through life feeling partially invisible. They show certain sides of themselves to family, others to colleagues, still others to friends or partners. Rarely does someone feel truly seen in their totality. When you communicate that you see beyond the masks, you create a space of psychological safety that becomes impossible to forget. A 45-year-old man from Seattle once shared with me, "After my divorce, I dated casually for years, but I never missed anyone until I met someone who seemed to recognize parts of me I'd forgotten existed. She noticed how I lit up talking about astronomy, a passion I'd abandoned in my 20s. Months after we stopped seeing each other, I'd still find myself wanting to call her whenever I read something about space. It wasn't really her I missed, but how she saw something in me that no one else bothered to look for." This man's experience illustrates the power of recognition. His former partner had acknowledged an aspect of his authentic self that had long been neglected. When she left, he missed not just her, but his reconnection to that part of himself. The second phrase carries similar depth. "Your wisdom guides me." This acknowledgement speaks to Jung's concept of the wise old man or wise woman archetype, the embodiment of insight and deeper truth within the psyche. When we acknowledge someone's wisdom, we're not simply flattering them, we're recognizing their connection to something profound within themselves. In American society, particularly for men, being acknowledged for wisdom, rather than just strength, success, or attractiveness, touches on something rarely affirmed. It speaks to the soul rather than the ego, and when someone recognizes this quality in you, their absence creates a unique form of longing, not just for their admiration, but for the version of yourself that they helped you recognize. A teacher from Chicago once explained, "Students come back to visit years later, not because I taught them algebra particularly well, but because for some of them, I was the first adult who treated their thoughts and perspectives as valuable. They don't miss my lessons. They miss how they felt heard and respected in my classroom." The third phrase delves even deeper. "You embody contradiction beautifully." Jung believed that psychological wholeness comes through the integration of opposing forces within the psyche, what he called the tension of opposites. When we acknowledge someone's ability to contain contradiction, we're recognizing their movement toward what Jung termed individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole. Modern American culture often pushes us toward consistency and simplicity. We're expected to have clear personal brands, straightforward opinions, and uncomplicated emotions. But human beings are naturally contradictory, both loving and angry, both confident and insecure, both selfish and selfless. When someone appreciates these contradictions, rather than demanding one-dimensional consistency, they create psychological space for genuine self-expression. A woman from Portland described her most meaningful relationship. He never tried to put me in a box. I could be fiercely independent one day and need support the next. I could be logical in my career and intuitive in my creative life. After we broke up, what I missed most was that freedom from having to be consistent all the time. Most people want you to be just one thing they can understand easily. This appreciation of contradiction creates a powerful psychological bond because it allows for authentic expression of the full self. When someone misses you for this quality, they're missing the freedom you gave them to be fully human. The fourth phrase speaks to potential. Your depth remains untapped. This acknowledgement touches on what Jung called the undiscovered self, the aspects of our potential that remain unrealized. By acknowledging someone's untapped depth, you're not just complimenting them, you're creating a psychological invitation to growth and self-discovery. In an achievement-oriented culture like America's, where worth is often measured by visible accomplishments, acknowledging someone's unseen potential creates a different kind of validation. It suggests that their value isn't limited to what they've already done or shown, but includes what they might yet become. A musician from Nashville shared, "I've had people praise my performances, but the producer who really got under my skin was the one who said, 'You haven't even scratched the surface of what you're capable of.' Years later, when I'm struggling with creativity, I still hear those words. I find myself wishing I could play something new for him, show him I'm still exploring that potential he saw." When someone misses you, because you recognize their untapped depths, they're longing not just for your affirmation, but for the guided journey into themselves that your presence facilitated. These four phrases, "I see you completely," "Your wisdom guides me," "You embody contradiction beautifully," and "Your depth remains untapped," work together to create a recognition that goes beyond surface-level attraction. They speak to the unconscious, to the yearning for integration and wholeness that Jung identified as the central psychological journey of human life. When properly expressed and genuinely meant, these words create not just momentary connection, but lasting psychological imprints. They trigger longing because they speak to essential human needs for recognition, meaning, acceptance, and potential. But there's an important caveat here. These phrases only work when they're authentic, when they represent genuine perceptions rather than manipulative tactics. The unconscious mind is remarkably adept at detecting insincerity. Using these phrases without genuine feeling behind them won't create meaningful connection. It will likely achieve the opposite. As we move forward, we'll explore how these insights can be applied to create meaningful connections, how they relate to Jung's broader understanding of the human psyche, and how they can contribute to your own process of individuation. Because ultimately, understanding why others miss you is a pathway to understanding yourself more completely, the true goal of any psychological exploration. When someone truly misses you, something far more complex than mere memory is at work. Jung would describe this as an activation of the unconscious, a stirring of psychological forces that exist beneath our everyday awareness. This chapter explores how the four phrases we've identified create this profound effect by engaging with what Jung called the shadow and the process of projection. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, contains all the parts of ourselves we've repressed, denied, or never fully developed. It holds our unacknowledged fears, our rejected qualities, and often our unrealized potential. Most critically for our understanding of emotional connection, it's also the psychological mechanism behind our most powerful attractions and aversions. The meeting of two personalities, Jung wrote, is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. This transformation occurs largely through the dance of shadow and projection, psychological processes that the four phrases we're exploring directly engage. Consider how this plays out in everyday American life. In our culture of constant digital connection, authentic recognition has become increasingly rare. We scroll through curated versions of others and present carefully managed versions of ourselves. Against this backdrop, the person who truly sees you, who speaks to your shadow as well as your persona, creates an almost alchemical reaction. A corporate executive from Chicago described this phenomenon. I manage hundreds of people and maintain relationships with clients across the country, but there's only one person whose texts I look for at the end of the day. She's a colleague who once told me, "You're not just the solutions guy, you're also the one who feels the problems most deeply." Somehow she spotted this sensitivity I've always worked to hide, because I thought it was incompatible with leadership. When we don't speak for a while, it's like this understanding part of myself goes back into hibernation. This executive's experience demonstrates how recognition of the shadow creates psychological dependency. The colleague acknowledged a disowned aspect of himself, his sensitivity, that he had pushed into his shadow because it didn't fit his conscious self-image. Her recognition didn't just create connection, it facilitated his own psychological integration. No wonder her absences felt so acutely. Let's examine how each of our 4 phrases engages with the shadow and unconscious projection. I see you completely works because it speaks directly to the shadow. When someone feels truly seen, it's often because you've acknowledged not just their conscious self-presentation, but elements they themselves may not fully recognize. You're creating what Jung would call a container for both their light and dark aspects. A professor from Boston shared, "My partner once told me, I see how you use humor to connect with students, but also how you use it to keep a safe distance." No one had ever named that pattern before. Years later, when we were apart for a semester while I taught abroad, I found myself constantly wanting to call him whenever I caught myself using that defense mechanism. It was like he had become my mirror, and without him, I couldn't see myself clearly. The phrase, "your wisdom guides me," activates what Jung termed the self, the archetype of wholeness, and the regulating center of the personality. By acknowledging someone's wisdom, you're recognizing their connection to something deeper than their everyday persona. You're seeing and affirming their link to collective wisdom that transcends individual experience. A nurse practitioner from Texas explained, "During the pandemic, a colleague once told me, 'Your intuitive wisdom about patients guides this whole department.' It wasn't just a compliment, it put into words something I'd always felt, but never valued about myself. My training emphasized evidence-based practice, but this intuitive dimension was something I'd never formally acknowledged." When she moved to another hospital, I found myself constantly thinking, what would Lisa say about this patient? I wasn't just missing her friendship, I was missing the permission she gave me to trust this aspect of myself. The phrase, "you embody contradiction beautifully," speaks to Jung's concept of the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to unite opposing forces to create new psychological possibilities. By acknowledging someone's capacity to hold contradiction, you're recognizing their movement toward wholeness rather than one-sided development. In American culture, where consistency is often valued over complexity, this recognition is particularly powerful. A writer from San Francisco described, "My most significant relationship was with someone who appreciated how I could be deeply rational and wildly intuitive at different moments." He once said, "I love that you're a walking contradiction, analytical and mystical at once." After we parted ways, I found myself unconsciously simplifying myself for new people, then missing him because I missed being my full contradictory self. It wasn't really him I was longing for, it was the me I could be around him. Finally, your depth remains untapped, activates what Jung called the prospective function of the psyche, its orientation toward future development and potential. This phrase acknowledges not just who someone is now, but who they might become. Software developer from Austin shared, "I had a mentor who routinely told me, 'You've barely scratched the surface of what you could create.' Years after changing companies, I still find myself mentally running new ideas by him first, not because he was always right, but because he saw capabilities in me that I was only just beginning to recognize in myself. When I miss him, I'm really missing that sense of expansive possibility he created around me." This developer's experience illustrates how acknowledging someone's untapped potential creates a psychological space that they continue to inhabit even in your absence. You become associated with their own growth and possibility. The power of these phrases lies in how they facilitate what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of psychological integration and wholeness. When you speak to someone in ways that acknowledge both their conscious and unconscious aspects, you become a facilitator of their individuation journey. Your absence then is felt not just as the loss of companionship, but as the loss of a guide in the essential psychological work of becoming whole. This process has particular resonance in contemporary American society, where authenticity is highly valued, but increasingly difficult to achieve. In a culture where social media encourages carefully curated self-presentation and professional environments often reward conformity, the person who sees beyond these masks and still offers acceptance becomes a psychological oasis. A marketing executive from New York reflected, "In a world where everyone's personal branding and positioning themselves, genuine recognition feels like finding water in a desert. The person who really sees you, complications, contradictions and all, becomes indispensable because they're the only one you don't have to perform for." This dynamic explains why superficial compliments rarely create lasting impact, while acknowledgement of deeper aspects of self can create bonds that persist across time and distance. The former addresses only the conscious personality, the persona in Jung's terminology, while the latter speaks to both conscious and unconscious elements of the psyche. It's worth noting that this process works on a reciprocal basis. When you truly see someone else, when you acknowledge their wisdom, appreciate their contradictions and recognize their potential, you're engaging in a form of psychological intimacy that transforms both parties. As Jung noted, the unrelated human being lacks wholeness, for he can achieve wholeness only through the soul, and the soul cannot exist without its other side, which is always found in a you. The phrases we're exploring create psychological dependency precisely because they facilitate this mutual recognition and growth. They establish you as someone who helps others become more integrated and whole. Your absence, then, isn't just the absence of another person. It's the absence of a mirror that reflects parts of themselves they struggle to see on their own. Therapist from Minneapolis observed, "The people we miss most aren't necessarily those who make us happiest in the conventional sense. They're the ones who make us feel most connected to ourselves, to parts we value but might lose sight of in daily life. They become external repositories for aspects of our own psyches." This insight helps explain why certain connections persist in our awareness even after prolonged absence. The person who triggers longing has often touched parts of the unconscious that continue to seek expression and integration. Consider your own experience. When you've deeply missed someone, what aspect of yourself felt more accessible in their presence? What understanding of yourself seemed clearer through their eyes? The answers reveal not just the nature of the connection, but aspects of your own psyche seeking recognition and integration. As we move forward, we'll explore how understanding these psychological dynamics can help you not just create meaningful impact on others, but also advance your own individuation process. Because ultimately, the ability to recognize the depth in others is inseparable from the ability to acknowledge and integrate your own psychological depths. The shadow dance of recognition and projection that creates longing is not just a pathway to connection with others, it's a doorway to deeper self-knowledge. Through understanding why others miss you, you gain insight into the psychological gifts you offer and the aspects of yourself that might still await integration. The mirror you hold up to others inevitably reflects something of your own depth and complexity. Understanding the psychological impact of our four phrases is meaningless without embodying them authentically. This final chapter explores how to integrate these insights into your way of being, not just your words. Jung believed that psychological development happens through relationship. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. This alchemy doesn't occur through techniques alone, but through genuine presence and recognition. In American culture, with its focus on quick fixes, we often reduce insights to formulas. But authentic connection emerges from depth, not strategy. The question becomes not just what to say, but how to develop the consciousness that makes genuine recognition possible. To embody the recognition that makes others miss your presence, consider these essential dimensions of psychological growth. First, developing active imagination, the capacity to see beyond literal meanings to symbolic understanding. This allows you to recognize the deeper significance beneath someone's words and actions. A professor from Vermont noted, The difference between someone who truly sees others and someone who merely observes them is like the difference between reading a poem for its literal meaning versus understanding its symbolic dimension. Second, cultivating psychological objectivity, the ability to distinguish between your projections and the actual person before you. This doesn't mean becoming coldly analytical, but developing discernment about where your unconscious material might color your perception. A psychologist from Seattle explained, "Most people are in relationships primarily with their own projections. When you develop the capacity to see someone apart from what you need them to be, you offer a rare gift, the experience of being recognized for who they truly are." Third, developing comfort with the tension of opposites, the ability to hold contradictory truths without prematurely resolving them. This allows you to recognize others' full complexity instead of reducing them to simplified versions. A community organizer from Detroit shared, "The people who create the strongest bonds aren't those who agree with everyone. They're the ones who can acknowledge conflicting perspectives without immediately trying to resolve the tension." Fourth, cultivating the symbolic attitude, perceiving experiences as meaningful rather than merely causal. This perspective helps you recognize the deeper significance in others' journeys and hold their stories in a context of meaning. Fifth, developing prospective awareness, the ability to perceive not just who someone is now, but who they are becoming. This forward-looking vision recognizes potential not yet manifest, but existing as possibility. An art teacher from Philadelphia reflected, "The best mentors weren't those who praised what I'd already accomplished. They were the ones who could see what I might create before I could see it myself." When you develop these capacities, our four phrases emerge naturally as authentic expressions rather than techniques. Your presence creates what Jung called a temenos, a sacred space of psychological safety where unconscious material can emerge into consciousness. A university dean observed, "The professors students remember decades later aren't those with the most knowledge. They're the ones who created psychological spaces where students could safely encounter new ideas and aspects of themselves. The people whose absence you felt most deeply were likely those who saw you more completely than you saw yourself. Their recognition facilitated your self-recognition, making their presence essential to your psychological integration." This capacity for deep recognition isn't limited to close relationships. It can emerge in professional contexts, casual interactions, or brief encounters. What matters is the quality of presence you bring. Paradoxically, the highest goal isn't to be missed, but to facilitate others' psychological integration so completely that they internalize your recognition, carrying it even in your absence. A meditation teacher noted, "The relationships that transform us are those where the other person's recognition becomes a bridge to our own self-recognition. Their absence is then felt not as emptiness, but as continuing presence. They've become part of our internal landscape." The most profound connection comes not from making others dependent on your recognition, but from helping them develop self-recognition. When you succeed, they may miss you less conventionally, but carry your influence more permanently. In a culture characterized increasingly by superficial connection, your capacity for genuine recognition addresses what sociologists call a recognition deficit. You contribute not just to individual relationships, but to a broader cultural need. By developing the consciousness that allows for authentic recognition, you offer others an increasingly rare experience of psychological homecoming, being recognized, not just for what they do or how they appear, but for who they are and might become. This recognition, when genuinely offered, creates bonds that transcend ordinary attachment, resonating long after your physical presence withdraws. It contributes to what Jung considered the essential psychological task of human life, the journey toward wholeness, toward becoming who we truly are.